Welcome to Unit 7, Westward Expansion, the Louisiana Purchase. We all know our nation spans the continent from sea to shining sea, but in the early 1800s, the western border of the United States was the Mississippi River. Thomas Jefferson took steps to change that. The Port of New Orleans. While the Supreme Court dealt with the midnight judges, Jefferson set his sights on expansion. The population in the region between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River had grown steadily. Now farmers were settling the area and shipping their crops down the tributaries of the Mississippi to New Orleans. From there, ships carried cargo to ports all over the world. Jefferson wanted to acquire New Orleans, only France stood in his way. In 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte overthrew the revolutionary government in France and took power. In 1800, he signed a secret treaty requiring Spain to return Louisiana to France. The Spanish government had decided that with only 50,000 settlers in all of Louisiana, the area was too expensive to maintain and produced too little profit. But Jefferson feared that once France owned Louisiana, it would interfere with American shipping in New Orleans. Fortunately for Jefferson, France now felt as burdened with Louisiana as Spain had, and was very willing to sell the territory to another nation. Soon, peaceful negotiations began between Napoleon and the United States. Napoleon's offer. Jefferson began sending James Monroe to France in 1803 to help negotiate the purchase of territory at the mouth of the Mississippi, including New Orleans. However, negotiations began to stall on the French side. Napoleon was having trouble in another part of the Americas, the Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue, now known as Haiti, on the island of Hispaniola. In 1791, Toussaint Louverture had led a successful revolution to free slaves in the French colony. Louverture governed the island until 1802, when Napoleon decided he wanted the colony back, but his actions resulted in an all-out war. Napoleon had had enough of the Americas. His forces had been reduced by yellow fever, an often fatal disease carried by mosquitoes in tropical climates, and he surrendered to Haitian independence. Without Saint-Domingue, Napoleon felt that Louisiana had little value. As a result, the French leader decided to give up all of his territory in continental North America. Instead of selling only New Orleans to the United States, Napoleon suggested selling the entire Louisiana territory, all 828,000 square miles, for just $15 million. In October 1803, the U.S. Senate ratified the treaty that established the Louisiana Purchase. France officially transferred the land to the United States, doubling the size of the nation. Jefferson's thoughts. He had some misgivings about the deal. He debated the constitutionality of the purchase, saying the general government has no powers but such as the Constitution gives it. It has not given it power to hold foreign territory, and still less of incorporating it into the Union. An amendment of the Constitution seems necessary for this. But Jefferson ended up putting his concerns aside. The land, he believed, would provide space for generations of American farmers and allow people in the region to trade freely on the Mississippi. Soon after the treaty with France was finalized, Jefferson funded an expedition to take a good look at the land and natural resources the country had bought. He could hardly wait to hear what the explorers learned about the plants, animals, and people in the region.
You may have noticed in the news lately that there was a supposed desire by the US government to purchase Greenland from Denmark. Now, while this sounds kind of crazy today, it's actually how the United States got a lot of its territory, like Alaska, Florida, or the place we'll be talking about today, Louisiana. The purchase of Louisiana was a gigantic step for the expansion of the United States. The territory of Louisiana spread across 15 current U.S. states: Arkansas, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Minnesota, Louisiana, New Mexico, Texas, South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, Colorado, and even a little bit of Canada. Imagine if the U.S. hadn't bought this land or taken control of it by any other means. It would probably have stopped their expansion west, dividing the future country in half and containing the U.S. in its current east coast. Maybe California and Texas would have still rebelled against Mexican rule, but remaining independent and larger states. Louisiana could have eventually declared independence from France, like the US did from Great Britain, and we would have 4 countries instead of 1. Now, first of all, what was Louisiana? The Louisiana Territory was part of France's North American colonies from 1682 to 1762. It's named Louisiana in honor of French King Louis XIV. In 1763, France lost the 7 Years' War against Great Britain. In what seems to be an attempt to not have Britain take the land, the French king, now Louis XV, gave the land to his cousin, Charles III of Spain, and so Louisiana became a Spanish territory. In 1800, however, with Napoleon now in charge of France, he bought back the territory from Spain as part of a broader project to re-establish a French colonial empire in North America. But France's colonial projects seemed doomed to fail. Their failure to put down a revolt in another colony, Saint-Domingue, plus the possibility of a new war against the United Kingdom, pushed Napoleon to consider selling Louisiana to the United States and abandon his American colonial ambitions. US President Jefferson was really happy about this because it had been his long-term goal to purchase Louisiana and control the Mississippi River as well as the port of New Orleans. His idea was to purchase it piece by piece, but this way he didn't need to wait. And so, 2 years later, in 1803, the US bought the territory from France in return for $15 million, or approximately $18 per square mile. That's a pretty good deal. The American government used $3 million in gold as a down payment, which Napoleon supposedly used to finance his planned invasion of England, which ended up never happening. The treaty was negotiated by the French Treasury Minister acting on behalf of Napoleon and American delegates acting on behalf of President Thomas Jefferson. But Jefferson didn't have such an easy time achieving this goal, facing a lot of domestic opposition. The Federalists, a political party at the time, strongly opposed the purchase, favoring close relations with Britain over close ties to Napoleon, and were concerned that the US had just paid a large sum of money to declare war on Spain, which still technically administered the territory. Many were also concerned about whether or not the purchase was constitutional. A lot of members of the House of Representatives opposed the purchase. They called for a vote to deny the request, but it failed by 2 votes, 59 to 57. It's crazy to think how close history came to be completely different, just 2 votes. The Spanish themselves weren't too happy about this either, claiming that France had previously promised not to alienate Louisiana to a third party, but in the end, everything worked out. The Spanish Prime Minister authorized the US to negotiate with the French government. Spain turned the territory over to France in a ceremony in New Orleans on November 30, a month before France turned it over to American officials. Later, on April 30 of 1803, the Louisiana Purchase Treaty was officially signed in Paris, being announced by President Jefferson to the American people on July 4th of that same year. Like I said, the purchase of the land also helped the expansion of the US territory, which with this nearly doubled in size overnight, also adding 60,000 new inhabitants to its population, allowing them access to the Mississippi River Basin, a gigantic plot of land, and a pathway to the west. In his speech, Jefferson stated, "From this day, the United States take their place among the powers of the first rank, demonstrating the incredible importance that this purchase and the territorial expansion that came with it had for the establishment of the United States as the country we know today and paving the way for its future status as a world power."
Just a quick review before we end this video. Napoleon decided to give up all territory in the continental North America. Instead of selling just New Orleans to the United States, Napoleon wanted to sell all 828,000 miles of it for only $15 million. October 1803, the U.S. Senate ratified the treaty that established the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson believed that the land would provide space for generations of American farmers and allow people in the region to trade freely on the Mississippi River. Jefferson funded the Lewis and Clark expedition to take a look at the land and natural resources the country had bought. We will talk more about the Lewis and Clark expedition on the next video. That's all for today's video.